Okay, so again, thank you all for joining me. So today we're going to talk a little bit about a few different things when it comes to the exam. And I did just drop the slides and as a PDF in the chat, so you have access to those and follow along if you so choose. So kind of first and foremost, we're going to take an overview, look at the CBMT exam, kind of what it entails, some things to look out for, some things to include, and some resources to check out from the beginning. And for those of you who have already taken the exam, a time or two, like this first part, a lot of this will be pretty familiar to you. So, one of the first things, oh, um, sorry, I got distracted by the chat. One of the first things that I recommend that all folks getting ready to take the exam or start preparing for the exam should take a look at is the candidate handbook. And I'm going to drop a link to that in the chat. If you'll give me just a second here. The candidate handbook and the CBMT website gives a really comprehensive view of what is required when it comes to this exam, some things to keep in mind, where to start when it comes to signing up for the exam, the domains, how to seek out accommodations if you need them, as well as the CBMT bibliography. So it has the reference list of all of the resources that the test writers used essentially to write the test. So I recommend really taking a look at that, taking some time to read through it, just so that you have a bit of an idea of exactly what it is that you will be walking into. And then also, it has kind of the blueprint for what you should study. Not necessarily how you should study them, but what you should be studying. And those are the CBMT domains. Something else to keep in mind as you kind of walk through this process is thinking about when and how you are going to sign up for the exam. So signing up for the exam is less than straightforward at times. You can also find that information on the CBMT website, but I'm going to drop that link in the chat and also tell you a little bit about how that looks. So to sign up for the CBMT website, you first have to make an account with CBMT, and then you will go into the candidates section and go to in your account in the candidate section to apply for the exam. This process is longer than you think that it is. For those of you who have already taken it, you probably know the first time that you do it, it takes kind of a few weeks before you can actually schedule your exam, because first you have to put in all of your information about the school you went to, if you've completed internship, but then CBMT also does a series of checks where they will reach out to your university program to make sure that you're actually eligible to sit for the exam. They have to have a letter from your internship director that says that you completed internship and are now eligible to sit for the exam. You have to order official transcripts as well. And if your graduation date is not conferred on your transcript, then again, they'll reach out to your faculty. And then once all of that is done and you pay the hefty fee of $325 for the first time, you then have to wait for them to process all of your information. That can take up to a couple of weeks as they set up your testing record with the external testing company, which is PSI. And so once your testing record is set up with PSI, they will then email you and say, here's your testing ID. Now you can go to the PSI website to actually schedule your test. And then even once you're at that point, sometimes, depending on how backed up where the site is where you live, you may have to wait a couple of weeks to actually find an exam time that is open. I know now that we are a couple of years into COVID, some of those delays have and backups have slowed down a bit, but in some cities they're still kind of backed up. at this point. So it might be a couple of weeks after you get your testing record that you can actually schedule a date for your exam. So just keep that in mind as you're thinking about your timeline, which is something that we'll talk a little bit about in just a bit. And then the next kind of like logistical thing that I want to just mention, the next two things are our test layout and our CBMT domains. So the test is made up of 150 multiple choice questions. And even though there are 150 questions, only 130 of those are scored. Because 20 of those questions CBMT uses as like test questions. They're testing them out to see statistically how people do. So your score will be out of 130, but the exam is 150 questions. And it's not like the bonus 20 are all at the end of the exam. They're sprinkled throughout. So you don't know which ones are the test questions and which ones are the scored questions per se. So that's something to keep in mind. But you do have just 3 hours for the exam unless you seek additional accommodations. And with that, and within those 3 hours, one of the things that was a piece of advice that somebody gave me was there's a question that you were just really, really stumped on, move on because it may be, one of those additional questions. But also, if you have time at the end, you can come back to it. But it's not worth it to kind of sink into that frustration and sit with a question for too long because you do have 150 of them to move through. Okay, and so the last little piece of this like logistical information is the CBMT domains. So the CBMT domains are the things that make up all of the questions, essentially. There are 5 of them, and those 5 domains are safety is number 1, referral, assessment, and treatment planning is number 2, treatment implementation and documentation is number 3, evaluation and termination of treatment is number 4, and professional development and responsibilities is number 5. And so those 5 domains kind of follow the therapeutic process. And within each of those 5 domains is a lot of smaller steps as well. So I'm actually going to stop my share so that we can go over to the... Oh, okay. Sorry. Google Slides is giving me a hard time. I'm going to stop my share so that we can go over to the CBMT website and take a look at those domains and see how they're kind of written out. If you haven't done that yet, we'll take a quick look at them together. So this document is kind of wordy and long, but a lot of important information. So each of the 5 domains also have included in them like how many questions from each domain are on the exam. So safety is not a very long domain, it's just 10. And because of that, there's only 5 questions on the exam that are from that domain. And then if you look at referral, assessment, interpretation of assessment, and treatment planning, that one's a bit longer, has a few more steps. It's a little bit more significant part of the exam, and that one has 35 questions. So it goes all the way down here. And it breaks down, each of these domains breaks down specific things about each element of the treatment planning and assessment process that the CBMT believes that you should know. So things like involving client in the treatment planning process when appropriate, and collaborating with other professionals, and establishing client goals and objectives that are SMART or specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time limited. And so these are, for the most part, probably things that you've been exposed to in school or in your internship. A lot of it is going to be knowledge that you already know, but it may be framed in a way that you are unfamiliar with. So that's something to keep in mind. The biggest section of the exam is the treatment implementation and documentation section. So there's 68 items in there. So pretty weighty, and then it's a whole page and a half. Evaluation and termination is pretty short, only 10 items, and then the final is also only 12 items. So if that's your first look at these domains, that's one of the first things that I recommend that you take a look at when you're planning your study plan or creating your study plan, because it will kind of drive how you structure your study plan. So we'll go back to the slides, but before we move on, does anybody have any questions or anything you'd like me to clarify? Hi to those of you who just joined.
I did have one question. I don't know if you said it or not. How long is the UCAB for the test? Like it's time. Is that
Yes, it's 3 hours.
okay?
Yeah. So you have 3 hours to complete it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay. Back to the show. Any other questions before I move on? Okay. So for kind of the rest of today, I want to take some time to think about and talk about setting up your study plan and some things to consider when you are setting up your study plan. So some of these things I've kind of already talked a little bit about, but the first of which is one of the most important things to think about is your timeline. So your timeline is two things. It is how long you have until you want to take the exam, or how long you are in your internship process, or the registration timeline as well. So most folks recommend studying for the exam for between 4 to 6 weeks of like concentrated study time. You can start earlier than that, but a lot of times when folks are thinking about starting earlier than that 4 to 6 weeks, they're still in their internship. It's not really recommended that you spend a ton of time during the process of your internship studying for the exam, because in your internship, that's a time to learn a very specific set of skills and really focus on like embedding yourself in that therapeutic process and really learning all that you can in that environment. So if you are going to study during your internship, it's recommended that you don't start prior to your last month of internship, and then spending about 4 to 6 weeks of concentrated study time. Because as I kind of mentioned before, most of the information on the exam is information that you probably already know. This isn't really an informations game, it is an application game, and that is where, and an interpretation game. So what makes this exam kind of tricky isn't necessarily the information that's presented, but it is figuring out how to apply the information that you already know to these very specific situations, or figuring out how to interpret the questions that they are asking you. So determine first and foremost how long you want to study, and start with reviewing that handbook. So one thing that really shaped my study plan, and it shaped how I broke out my timeline, how I structured each week and each day, and the amount of time that I was studying, was I broke down my study time by domains. So I said, okay, in this week, I'm going to be reviewing this. In this week, I'm going to be reviewing this. In this week, I'm going to be reviewing this. And I gave myself 4 weeks to study. And I ended up, I wanted to give myself 4 weeks. I ended up having 6 because I couldn't take the exam as soon as I wanted to, just because the testing center was backed up. So, again, I structured each of my weeks with a specific domain or two. Like I paired safety and professional development, because safety didn't really require very much of me to study. And then once I did that, I built my plan according to the timeline of when I wanted to take the exam and according to how I was breaking down the domains. So that's another thing that I recommend. um, it's probably not going to be the most beneficial if you're sitting down each day or each week um, and just reading through a textbook for a few different reasons, but also that's like a lot of information dump. So part of building a plan is figuring out how you're going to structure your time. So I knew that I was studying specific things in each week, and then on specific days I was studying, maybe I was chunking the information, but also I was switching up how I was studying or what I was using to study each of the days that I elected to study in a week. And because for me, it wasn't realistic or helpful for me to study every single day, I picked 4 days of my week that I was going to study, and I stuck to a pretty strict study schedule. So that's another thing that I would recommend is creating not only a plan but also a schedule for your study time. So pick a day or days, pick the days and pick a time block of when you're going to study, and then assign tasks or for what you will be studying and how you will be studying on each of those days. And so let's talk a little bit about what I mean when I say how you will be studying. So you all have already mentioned, those of you who've taken the exam, you've mentioned all of these resources already. So it sounds like some of you all are already very familiar with some of the resources that exist. Things like the self-assessment exam or the practice exams that are provided by CBMT. There's 2 of them, an A test and a B test. They're very similar, but they're also kind of expensive. They're $50 a test. So I recommend buying one and finding a friend who buys the other and studying them together in a study group. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But the reason that I really liked the self-assessment tool or the practice exam was because it was more than just like, oh, am I able to get all of the answers right or a lot of the answers right. It allowed me to get into the brain of the exam writers and learn the why. It was more important than learning the what in understanding this exam. So the first time that I took the exam, I attempted to, model it after as close to the testing conditions as I could. So I set myself a timer and I sat in a room with my computer with nothing else going on, no one else around. I locked my room door, that's where I was. I sat at my desk because I knew I would be sitting in a chair at a desk in the testing center. And I timed myself and I took the exam all the way through the first time. And then after that, I continued to use the self-assessment tool as a study tool by examining the answers, the correct answers, but also the rationale. So one thing that's really nice about the self-assessment is with each practice exam, you also, when they send you the answers and the key, they also send you a list of rationale. So it's like, here is the question, and here's why this question was right, or this answer was right, but here's why the other 3 answers were wrong. So it was really helpful for me to get into the brain of the test a little bit and examine why the answers were wrong, more so than why the answers were right. For all of the questions, especially the ones that I got right. Because it was more important for me to know why those answers were important, because then I could apply some of those same concepts when I actually took the exam. Another tool, study tool that was really effective for me was finding a study group, and it honestly ended up it started as a study group and became a study partner. As some people either passed or just stopped coming. But I think if you can find even one consistent study partner, it is so valuable in helping you to connect somebody is always going to know something that you don't, or they'll remember something that you don't. And something that was really helpful for me was I actually found a study group, or created a study group out of a Facebook group. It was called the MT uh, Students and Interns. And I, yeah, I found three girls in that group who it started as like 16, but it ended up just being the three of us or four of us. And we all went to different universities. And that was so valuable for me because with that, they all learned things differently than I learned them. And there was honestly some information that they learned that I didn't learn, and vice versa. So it was not only really helpful for me to learn from them, but it also gave me the opportunity to teach. So, um, you know, there's a lot of research out there that says that like teaching helps to reinforce your own learning. So for me, being able to re-articulate or teach a concept that I was like shaking on, it one helped me to understand just how much I knew and where the holes in my own knowledge were, but it also helped to reinforce the knowledge that I already had, and the information that I already knew. So studying with a peer, even just one, or with other folks in a study group, can be really valuable. You all mentioned books, uh, which are a great study tool, truthfully, but it's not always going to be the most effective to just read through it because, again, that's just an information dump. And so I'll talk on the next slide a little bit about how I structured my study time and how I used a lot of these tools in my studying. And then I know not everybody is like this, but I am a little bit of a pack rat in a lot of ways, and I saved every single notebook that I took notes in throughout my entire undergrad. And I didn't know until I started studying for the exam just how valuable that would be for me, because I was able to review a lot of notes that I found were like directly applicable to the specific domains. Going through the notebooks from my methods classes and my psych of music class and even theory. Reviewing theory and my theory notes was so valuable for that exam in a way that I don't think I would have like thought to do if someone hadn't told me like, oh, don't forget to study theory because theory is kind of embedded in most of the questions on this exam. It's like woven throughout. So those are some potential study tools. And then on the next slide, we're going to talk about structuring your study time and some ways to do that, and some ways to incorporate the study tools that you use. But before we move on to that, does anybody have any questions, thoughts, anything come to mind?
I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just like your experience, like when you studied and you spent like your time blocks, how long did you study per week and like per day? Like,
Yeah, so that actually depended on what I was doing. So, like I said, I studied 4 hours. I mean, sorry, 4 days out of the week. At the time that I was studying, I was offered a job at my internship, like right out of my internship. And I had like a provisional hiring until I passed the exam. So I was working 2, 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday for them. And so I studied for 3 hours each on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then 1 hour on Saturdays. And so, or an hour and a half on Saturdays. And so Mondays, I would typically do like reviewing books and class notes. Wednesdays, I was really going over the self-assessment and then implementing things like Quizlets or some theory practice. Fridays, I was comparing notes that I took as I was reading with some of my class notes and kind of scanning between the two. And then Saturdays were study group days. So it was pretty structured. I had a goal for what I wanted to study on each of those days, and exactly what materials I was going to be using to study them. And so that's kind of, does that answer that question, I guess?
Yes, it does. Yeah, because I've been doing 3 hours also, but I get like sometimes I feel like it's not enough, and then other times I feel like it's too much.
Yeah.
So I was just like curious as to how long you studied.
Yeah. And I think so. One thing I will say is length is not necessarily the most prevalent thing to like structure your study time. I think that it's finding a length of time that works for you. So it may be that some days 3 hours is too long, and some days 3 hours. Personally don't think that like focused studying should last longer than 3 hours at a time, just because of like brain fatigue. Like that's a lot of brain power. But that's for me. Maybe 3 hours, longer than 3 hours would work for you. But maybe it's that your time doesn't have to be static each day that you're studying. Maybe you intentionally build your schedule out so that you're studying for a specific amount of time each day, but it doesn't have to be the same amount of time each day.
Right, right. Yeah, because like sometimes I do like an hour and a half blocks
Yeah.
so that I can get stuff done that way. But yeah, I was just curious. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so um, one of the things that I think is really important to remember or consider when you are studying and like structuring your study time and deciding which tools to use is that it should be a multi-pronged approach. Not every study tool works for every person. Not everything is going to be effective for every person. I did a lot of book reviews because I know for myself that like reading texts and applying them to real world situations is one, a strength of mine, but two, one of the most important ways and consistent ways that I learn. But one of the gals in my study group did not read a single textbook the entire time in their studying because that wasn't helpful for her. So she would use like old notes or create Quizlets or use the self assessment. She spent a lot more time in study groups than I did, um, but she did not open a single textbook in her studying. But she knew herself enough to know that textbooks wouldn't be helpful. So it's not about necessarily like using all of the resources the same amount of time. It's not about oh, I'm going to read this book and that's going to help me pass this exam. It's about finding a balance of multiple approaches and multiple resources that work for you. If you're somebody who learns really well, having someone else like teach you something or review something with you, and maybe finding a tutor would be a good use of your time. Or if you're someone who learns really well when you're teaching somebody else, a study group, and spending more time in the week in study groups might be a better use of your time. Or reviewing books for me was really helpful. And one thing that I kind of mentioned is like really structuring your time. So this was what my breakdown looked like. I spent about 45% of my study time reviewing books, and that was like the biggest piece. And then the second biggest piece was the study or the practice exam and analyzing that, because that was again for me really instrumental in helping me to pass the exam. So I'll tell you all a little bit about like my process, and then we'll talk about some ways that you could implement this for yourself. So I use the domains to structure my study time, and I had like 4 or 5 books that I was using. I was using the Hanser, the Music Therapy Handbook, the Knight Lagasse intro book, and the old Davis Wheeler intro book, if you have that. And I sat down and I picked a domain a week. And what I would do is I would find the relevant chapters on that domain in the intro book or in the Hanser, because the Hanser is really nice because it's really laid out just like the exam, pretty much exactly. And so I followed the Hanser and picked a domain a week, and I would read that chapter in the Hanser and take notes on it. And then I would, maybe not in the same day, maybe later in that week, I would pick a second book and I would go to the chapters that focused on that domain in that other book to hear from different authors a little bit different perspective. A lot of times, really similar information, just worded differently or slightly differently, or from a different like shift in perspective. And I would read that, take notes on it, and then I would compare the notes from the two books, and then I would add in the third and compare the notes from all three. So it was giving me multiple perspectives, multiple ways of looking at the same problems. And some of the books I really liked because they had a lot of like vignettes and examples, like the Wheeler, the Music Therapy Handbook, has a lot of like clinical vignettes woven into the book. And so I would, then take those vignettes and the self-practice exam, and I would compare them or create like fake questions based on the self-assessment, and compare it to the vignette or whatever. Or I would, take the book and the vignette, and I would say, oh, I like, what domain do I think that this is addressing, and what part of this domain do I think that this is addressing? And then on another day, I would just focus on the practice exam, and I would pick, or I'd go through of it chunk by chunk. And one of the things that was really helpful for me was identifying what domain I thought each question was focusing on. Because a lot of times those questions throw a lot of extra information at you. And by kind of identifying, even just like really quickly in your brain, what domain they might be asking about, helps you to kind of toss out some of the additional information that isn't as relevant to the question. So, if they're, talking about this person's preferred music and the fact that their daughter is grieving and the fact, like, their religion, but the question that they're asking is about, like, the termination process. A lot of this extra information is kind of thrown in there to confuse you a little bit, or it might confuse you or throw you off. But if you're able to identify, oh no, this is what this question is asking about, this is the focus of this question, then it's easier to parse out some of the unnecessary information in the question and then weed out some of the answers that aren't relevant. So the study process and like creating my plan was really about finding a balance of the different resources and figuring out how to structure those times for myself within the time that I was allotting for each resource and in my study chunks of time. So I guess like the main thing is that this is different for every single person. It was different for me than it was for all three of the other folks in my study group. We all studied for this exam differently, but we were still able to use each other as a resource and as like a sounding board and as another person who was going through it at the same time as we were. So there are a lot of things to kind of consider, but I think similarly to the exam, one of the things that's most important to remember is that there's no one right way to do this. There's no one right way to be a therapist. So, yeah. Any questions about that piece? Okay. So, yeah, I kind of already said this. Whoops. Just like a reminder, to make it personal, the only way that this is going to work is if it works for you. There's no best way. There's just your way. So find the way that is the way that works for you. And that can be a bit of a trial and error. Like sometimes you can try something for a week or a couple of days, and if you're like, actually, this isn't working, this isn't like helping me to be able to contextualize any of this information, then it's like, okay, try something different. Um, yeah. And kind of finally, and something I always remind folks when they're getting ready to take this exam for the first time or the fifth time is just like, I know it can be really frustrating to take this exam more than once and not pass it. And I know that it can kind of feel really disheartening. But I just want to remind you, if someone hasn't told you this before, but I'm sure that they have, maybe they haven't, but this exam is not a reflection of your worth, and it's definitely not a reflection of your validity as a therapist. By the time you get to the point of taking this exam, you are a therapist. This is just the piece of paper that you have to check off to, get to the next stage, and be able to walk in the truth of who you already are and the profession that you are already a part of. So that's it for the talking for me for right now. Does anybody have any questions or any thoughts, reflections? Okay, so I'm gonna stop let me just say this. So next week, we are going to just spend some time. I have some worksheets that we'll work through to kind of help you identify like time blocks, of like how to structure your time, and then like what times of day or days of week might make the most sense for you to study, based on just some like reflection activities on things that you may have done in the past, that were effective in studying other things, and then we'll work together to kind of create your study plan. And I have a template of like a little planner, like a study planner essentially, that you can use to kind of guide that process for you. So I'm going to stop the recording. Maybe